Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to speak about a different knowledge system, which is different but is very relevant, pertaining the current environmental challenges we are all facing. Today I will talk a little bit about indigenous science. You can call it indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, but I will bring indigenous science today for all of you. And I will also start my presentation with some frequent myths and misconceptions as an indigenous scientist. The most common myths I receive as part of my career. But before to start, I want to introduce myself again, because this morning was very short, so you can understand why I arrived at this point in my career. So like you, I have a scientific training, so I did a PhD in Germany. I have been research scholar at the Richard Carlson Center for Environment and Society in Munich. I have been collaborating with the Autonomous University of Barcelona in Spain. I'm a scholar at the Bayer Institute of Ecological Economics in Sweden. I have been a scholar at the IASA in Austria and in other places, and recently appointed Global Young, a member of the Global Young Academy at Leopoldina in Germany. I also have some multilateral experience. I will say, like, I have worked for UNESCO at the local Indigenous Knowledge System program. I have collaborated with IBES, CBD, IUCN, ICROM. I have been delegate at expert mechanism of the rights of indigenous peoples, at the permanent forum of indigenous peoples. So you can see that my career has been in two different paths. I can say, but I'm an indigenous Maya woman, so I grew up in a small community in Mexico. And after many years doing science and doing my research, I realized that the knowledge of indigenous peoples was not really influencing any of the policies or the practice. And we were having a lot of indigenous colleagues and indigenous representatives attending COPs, but they were not even allowed to enter those spaces in which negotiations are taking place. So I wanted to move. My idea was to move from activism to diplomacy through an indigenous lens. So I started to work on my own indigenous-led organization, which is Indigenous Science. We started 8 years ago, but we were formally or legally established in Mexico less than 2 years ago. So the reason I started with this new idea or indigenous science diplomacy is because we all share this beautiful planet, and it's in the collective interest of all of us, not only politicians, not only scientists, all of us, to understand, to observe it, to understand the changes and behavior. And we have Western science, that's right, and it's considered the most fundamental and inclusive of all sciences. But there is a contradiction in this. This pseudo-inclusive science was established all around the world through different processes of colonization, conquest, abuses of power, marginalization, sometimes violence, which leave behind other types of knowledge systems, other types of sciences. And the problem is that most of us, the scientists, we don't know about that. And this presentation is not about a battle of paradigms. It's just I want to speak about indigenous peoples from an indigenous perspective, which is my perspective, of course. So we, as a scientist, we are trained we think that science started a few years ago, and there was nothing before that. But that's not true. For example, we mentioned some someone talked about biogeography and named von Humboldt, but there were previous native scientists that were able to bring that knowledge into the conversation, but we don't know about those indigenous or native scholars. So essentially, the science, modern science, Western science, or mainstream science has been passed down through the travels of Europeans to different places all around the world. And they took advantage of those journeys to collect data and bring back this information about flora, fauna, etc., to Western Europe, basically. However, this information has already been collected and studied by indigenous and native groups living in the places that the majority of Europeans were thinking they were colonizing. This information not only included flora and fauna, but also precise and accurate knowledge of medicinal properties, of ecosystem dynamics, behavioral changes of species, and also how those native societies were very good at understanding the movement of celestial bodies. I'm not going to give examples, but we have Linnaeus and other academics. So, but I want, with these ideas, I want to give you some of the most frequent myths and misconceptions I receive from non-Indigenous scholars. I'm not going to give you all the responses because of time limitations, but if you want to know more, you can find some of the responses in my book, in my chapter. So one of the frequent myths I receive about Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous science is that Indigenous knowledge is similar to other knowledge systems. Indigenous knowledge of the past is not the same as that of today. Indigenous knowledge is intangible. It cannot be counted, or it has no tangible value. Indigenous knowledge cannot be included in Earth observations due to poor credibility or accuracy of data. Indigenous peoples are an homogeneous group. Indigenous knowledge is not important in political and scientific spheres. Indigenous knowledge is not science because it is seen as imprecise and difficult to interpret. Sometimes the indigenous knowledge is portrayed as esoteric or folkloric. I have a few responses. So, for example, in relation to indigenous knowledge is not a science because it is imprecise, there is the proper answer is that indigenous knowledge is based on a careful observation, experimentation, and transmission of natural phenomena and across generations, is very precise within its context, and many groups have long made accurate predictions of natural phenomena, such as equinoxes, solstices, without modern technology. And some of those events have not happened, so they will happen in the future. Another common myth is that indigenous knowledge must be combined with Western science. This is a commonly accepted idea within the academic sphere, but this can lead to serious erosion of knowledge, particularly in groups that have lost important amount of knowledge and language, like indigenous peoples. Because combining different knowledge systems to solve current environmental problems towards sustainability are rooted in inclusive participation, but these sometimes do not lead to construct new knowledge, since the instruments and tools used to solve those problems come from methodologies and approaches that are not from indigenous paradigms. So there is a romanticization of indigenous knowledge and manipulation of indigenous knowledge to fit international agendas. Another common myth is that indigenous knowledge is lost. If it's lost, it will not matter, since we have other science, including Western science, that can replace it. The truth is that we are facing so many challenges, environmental ones, and so in the way that the policy and the academic sector have interacted with indigenous peoples and their knowledge is very relevant to consider, because even a small erosion of the knowledge of indigenous peoples represents an existential threat to humanity, to species, etc. So, but my presentation is not about the myths and the misconceptions. It's just about this romanticization and scientization of indigenous knowledge, and its manipulation is what causes a lot of problems in understanding it. So we really need to start thinking about indigenous knowledge as something very precise, very accurate, which can bring further information to the table of decisions. I want to emphasize that indigenous peoples were the first to observe and understand complex processes on Earth, to notice changes in natural phenomena, and to gain critical knowledge to adapt to those changes. Indigenous peoples, they have their own systems of knowing the world, of observing it, collecting information, categorizing it, using, recording, disseminating, revising information and concepts that explain how the world works. This is a whole paradigm that involves methods, tools, approaches, philosophies, principles, but we don't know about them. So this information, including the values and practices, should enrich global scientific discourse and policy making, fostering a more inclusive, comprehensive, and culturally sensitive approaches to addressing the world challenges. And that's the reason we are here. But who are indigenous peoples? Indigenous peoples are not a monolith, so they are all around the world in different countries. They manage and protect the most important biodiverse areas of the world, even though they represent less than 6% of the world population. And two important aspects to consider. They have this precise knowledge and understanding of the natural world, and also a cultural and spiritual connection that make them particularly relevant for the protection of nature and to work towards sustainability. And perhaps now you are realizing, oh, this crazy girl is talking about things that I don't understand, but I want to bring the evidence you all need in order to start considering indigenous knowledge as something which has a lot of value. So I will, I'm not gonna use a lot of your time, so I can bring a lot of examples, but I will emphasize and I will bring examples from indigenous peoples' Earth observations, and I will emphasize the knowledge of indigenous peoples of water systems across the hydrological cycle. So I'm not going to focus on food systems or in other aspects. I will focus on the water system. So, for example, indigenous peoples have been very good in understanding cryospheric processes, and this information can support global monitoring for efforts of cryospheric models, for example. So the dynamic nature of sea ice complicates the collection of information across the ice, ocean, and atmosphere. So we need multi-decadal long-term observation, and this information can be provided by indigenous peoples. For example, indigenous peoples in Siberia, they have been very good in understanding the different types of snow, the layers, the depth, the degrees of softness, the hardness, snow conditions, quality on reindeer pastures, and a lot of knowledge which is very important for understanding tundra ecology. But this information is not adopted in global climate models. Let's have a look of the lacustrine system. It's important to identify pollution sources, mapping contamination in lakes, because this information sometimes is complicated to obtain. So we really need information in situ and on the ground. So indigenous peoples can provide this information and accurate data on dynamics of physical properties of water. Let's look at example of Canada, the First Nation in Canada. They possess accurate knowledge of changes in freshwater ecosystems, decreasing water levels, drying of lakes and rivers, changes to freshwater quality, temperature, shoreline, etc., etc., etc. This is not something I'm just bringing from my imagination. There is science-based evidence about those observations. Let's look at example of groundwater systems. So, to understand groundwater patterns, we use tracers to understand how groundwater moves, but this is complicated in some groundwater systems which are complex, like in the Yucatan Peninsula, for example. But indigenous peoples can help us to understand how groundwater flows, where are those groundwater caves, and to help us understand the dynamics of complex groundwater basins. We have the example of the Falak knowledge in Oman and Iran about groundwater systems, or we have also information about the Mayas and how they develop complex water management dependent on water collection and storage devices. So this is an example of a cenote in Yucatan. So the Mayas were very good in tailoring the biophysical conditions, and they were able to adapt and to thrive as a civilization. I have, for example, the Mayas were very good in building reservoir systems and underground cisterns to storage rainwater so they can survive very dry seasons. They were also able to filtrate water using aquatic plants and the use of sand to purify water. Again, this is not my imagination. There is science-based evidence about that. The ocean, how before a few years ago, the only information that we have about the ocean came from infrequent measurements collected from ships and trawlers. So much of the knowledge that we have today about the oceans come from the Pacific navigators and other indigenous communities that were able to understand ocean systems. Let's have a look of the ETAC navigation system, which those societies were able to navigate long distances without the technology we have today. We also have an example of the Tiwi people in Australia. They were able, and they are very good in understanding species connectivity, marine processes, currents, tides, and other natural phenomena like the movement of celestial bodies, and used to precise navigation techniques. We have the Carolinian Star Compacts. I'm not going to go into detail because of time issues. So we have also atmospheric science, including the Evenki people of Siberia, the Akawayo weather forecasting. So I can give you several examples of why this information is particularly relevant to the current environmental challenges we are facing, and also how this information should be used in our efforts towards transformation towards sustainability. We have, for example, another knowledge from the Mayas communities, like this weather forecast calendar, which is called the Xocquín, in which the Mayas were observing nature, changing weather patterns, and considered bioindicators such as animals and plants. So essentially what I wanted to bring is that I'm not going to, this information, I'm just going to give it to you so you can draw your own conclusions. I'm not telling you this science is better than this one. It's just, for me, it's important to recognize that previous the science we have today, there was a knowledge that has been eroded, and which is very relevant for humanity as a whole. So essentially, indigenous peoples, Earth observations and sciences provide a different and rich data set and documentation which with a high level of detail that is usually not included in global Earth observations. Also that indigenous knowledge can be correlated to instrumental measurements captured through global Earth observation tools, and most importantly, it's necessary a respectful co-conversion of paradigms for the future of planet and humanity. So I can give you not only methods, tools, approaches, but also examples of philosophies, examples of principles from indigenous knowledge traditions. But essentially what I want to give you today is that we indigenous peoples, we have our own protocols, approaches and methods for collecting and monitoring information. So it's our indigenous science, and this science should be recognized as equal and indispensable pillar of global knowledge, integrated or waived or whatever you want to, the word you want to use, into research, education and policy making. And most importantly, even if a country does not have indigenous communities, it is still important to consider indigenous knowledge systems, since they offer valuable insights for sustainability, environmental management, and cultural diversity that can inspire positive practices anywhere in the world. So if you want to know more, reach me. I will be here almost the entire week. Yeah, do you have any questions?